2022. There are two teams in this debate. On the affirming, we have the University of Sydney Union 1, and on the negating, we have the University of Sydney Union 3. The motion that the two teams are debating is that Western states should support local rebel groups, bracket, e.g., by funding them and giving them intel, close bracket, as opposed to direct military intervention in other states. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome the first speaker of the affirming team.
Hi, just confirming you can hear me. Okay, sweet. I'm going to explain 4 things in this speech. Firstly, I'll explain why these rebel groups are people in principle that we want to defend. Secondly, I'll explain why this strategy creates less collateral damage. Thirdly, I'll explain why we get better governance in the long term. And fourthly, I'll explain why this is a more effective strategy in intervention. Firstly, though, I want to set up quickly why Western countries are likely to choose the particular rebel groups that they sponsor well. 3 reasons. First of all, these rebel groups often have very long histories. It's often a history of conflict between rebel groups and these governments, which suggests to you that Western governments will have a large amount of information on these groups with which to make this decision. But second of all, we think they're likely to face a lot of domestic political pressure to choose these groups well, and particularly along the lines of ideology, particularly in countries like the US, we think that governments are likely to face an enormous amount of pressure to choose these groups well. They do not want to be the particular leaders that chose the group badly. But thirdly, Western countries obviously have long-term security concerns, which means they are likely to have a vested interest in choosing these groups well. All of that should suggest to you that they are not likely to choose rebel groups with particularly poor ideologies. They're likely to choose rebel groups well. And I guess the 2 notes that I'd make here is, first of all, as the affirmative team on policy debate, we probably do just have the modelling power to suggest that they would choose these groups well. But second of all, obviously all of that structural analysis explains why they're likely to do so anyway, even if you don't believe that. We think then they're likely to select these rebel groups along 2 axes. The first is ideology, which means they are unlikely to select rebel groups with particularly abhorrent ideology. They are likely to choose ones that they are aligned with and ones that are good. But second of all, they are likely to decide on the basis of how effective they are for all of those reasons. First argument then, why are these rebel groups people that we do want to defend? And the note that I'd make at the top of this is just that when military intervention, which is the alternative that the negative team has to support, is going on, it is extraordinarily hard to get things like aid for rebel groups or to get aid for groups that are struggling. So the first thing, given that I'm going to explain, is why these rebel groups are often particularly vulnerable. That is, they are often ethnic minorities being actively purged or cleansed from these countries when there's a huge amount of conflict. Why is that? 4 reasons. First of all, often they are rebels because they are part of an ethnic minority, and that is the thing that drives them to form a rebel group, because they are in the minority. But second of all, they're often made into these kinds of rebel groups because of their mistreatment, often on the basis of things like ethnicity. But thirdly, we would say that irrespective of the reason that these groups become rebels, often these rebel groups are treated particularly badly by their governments. Often they are being actively purged and cleansed, even if it is not on the basis of things like ethnicity. They're often literally actively undergoing a process of being cleansed by the state. That should suggest to you that they are particularly vulnerable, irrespective of where they come from. But fourthly, given the explanation I give in setup to explain why governments are likely to select these rebel groups well, this is the most likely characterization of these rebel groups. If you believe that governments are likely to select rebel groups with, not abhorrent ideologies, with good ideologies, they're most likely to choose the ones that are the most vulnerable. These rebel groups literally are just vulnerable people. Second of all, why do we help them? 3 reasons. The first is that we give them things like weaponry to defend themselves. That automatically gives a huge amount of help to these people. They can defend themselves against governments that, as I explained, often are actively trying to purge them. But second of all, obviously at the point at which they have things like weaponry and they have things like resources, that obviously creates a disincentive to attack them. And that is an enormous benefit to these people's safety. They're already vulnerable. Now you give them protection, you create a disincentive for the state and other groups to attack them. But thirdly, often in the process of giving them military aid, you also give them sort of the kinds of logistical aid that make their lives materially better. So that's things like the kinds of logistical support like medicine and food, which comes along with military aid, massively improves these people's lives. The upshot of that is that a huge amount in our world, vulnerable people get help that do not get help on their side, and I would note that is certain, right? Like all of that analysis certainly suggests that people who are vulnerable get help if they want to explain why these groups are likely to get support, they have like a long, tricky road of mechanization to explain why military intervention gets that. This is far more direct and far more certain. We help these people enormously. That's a win on its own. Second of all, though, why does it create less collateral damage? And I know the impact of that is just that far, far less people die. Fighting is far less violent. That is extraordinarily important. A few things to explain. First of all, we would note that when you're sponsoring rebel groups and giving rebel groups as kind of weaponry, those where rebel groups have an incentive to look after the country, have a far greater incentive to look after the country than sort of Western soldiers that would intervene would. And that's just for the reason that they have to keep living there. Often they are fighting literally on the basis of wanting to protect that country or wanting to see that country look a particular way. They have a vested interest in keeping it that way. They have far more of an incentive to protect the country. But especially if they're planning to be the government one day or to take over the government, they want to have good facilities, right? Like they're far less likely to do things like bomb factories because they want factories to be able to support a population that one day they will rule. They're far less likely to do things like bomb hospitals. All of those kinds of things mean you get far less collateral damage because these rebels have far more of an incentive to protect the country. But second of all, often these groups are deeply nationalistic, and even if they don't like the current government, often they care deeply about the people, and that means that they have an interest in creating less collateral damage. They're far less likely to do things like carpet bombings, which are things that Western military intervention often does, because they care about the people. They don't want to see civilians die. They're far less likely to kill them. Thirdly, we think in this world, Western countries are probably not likely to be giving over their biggest weaponry, things like predator drones. All of those things they're far less likely to give to a rebel group. And that's sort of for two reasons. The first is that obviously you don't want them to get into enemy hands. You are likely to trust Western soldiers more, like you're likely to trust Western soldiers with that weaponry more. You're less likely to give it over to rebel groups, which just means that they have less artillery to create an enormous amount of damage to civilians. But the second thing to say is just that you are unlikely to need this massive weaponry. You're unlikely to need things like predator drones or to do things like carpet bombing when you have the knowledge of the terrain that rebel groups often have, but Western soldiers necessarily don't, because they have an edge in strategy for that reason. They do not need this weaponry. They're far less likely, we wouldn't give it to them for all those reasons, but they're far less likely to use it. That creates less collateral. Fourthly, though, having better knowledge of sort of terrain, things like language, all of the things you would know about if you were a rebel group actively living in that country, means that you can capture territory and do the kinds of things that Western troops want to do as well without incurring the enormous amount of collateral damage. That is to say, you are able to sort of adopt a far less blunt approach than soldiers would need to, because they don't know the terrain. You're more likely to be able to do things that are strategic. You know far more about that country. The impact of that is enormous. Collateral damage in this kind of conflict kills a huge amount of innocent civilians who did not ask to be there. People literally watch their families die in these kinds of conflict. Huge amounts of resources get destroyed. Things like hospitals, things like factories that provide for people, all of those things get destroyed in Western intervention. We reduce that. Again, a huge win for side affirmative. Third thing I'm going to explain is why we get better governments into the long term. Two main reasons. The first is that when the West is no longer setting up the government after the conflict, that's a huge benefit, because the West often has adverse incentives and empirically and historically has done an enormous amount of things like privatizing state assets, which leads to a huge amount of pain for the people in these countries. Rebel groups are far more likely to set up governments in the interests of the people for all of the reasons I explained earlier, to suggest why they care about the people, why they're deeply nationalistic. All of that suggests that they will do a far better job at setting up the government. But second of all, you're less likely to get backslide into the old regime purely for the reason that you are not seen as an imposition. Often, Western intervention is seen as extraordinarily imperialistic to these people. That means you get things like backslide. On our side, we get far less backslide. We get better transitions into government into the future. That means governments are more likely to be stable. Instability and backslide literally does kill people. We save people that huge amount of pain. Fourth argument then, this is a more effective strategy in intervention. And I know that this is less important than the previous issues, right? Because it's often not clear whether Western intervention is good. All of those things, saving civilians for death, getting less collateral, all of that certainly is a benefit. But to the extent that you don't, but this is sort of iffy. A few reasons why we get better intervention though. Firstly, for the reasons I explained earlier, they're more likely to have local knowledge. They're more likely to be able to do that fighting better. Second of all, they are less likely to face internal opposition. Again, for the reasons I explained earlier, like you're less likely to be seen as Western imperialist. But thirdly, the tactics and strategy will be specific to that area. Again, for the reasons I explained earlier. At the end of all of that, incredibly proud to have.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the first speaker of the negating team.
Just confirming I'm audible. Great. Starting in 5 seconds. The Taliban got off the ground because Americans funded it against the Soviets. I don't think Affirmative team could just get in that they're going to choose the good ones. But even if they could, we're going to explain to you on side negative why it's a far less effective strategy at ensuring long-term peace for these regions than actually just providing direct targeted military assistance that will do a much more efficient job of ending the war. I'm quickly at some points of setup, then I'm going to prove 3 things. Firstly, why it's better at entering wars. Secondly, why it improves the process of wars. And thirdly, why it improves the outcomes of wars. Rebuttal will be integrated. Briefly on setup, firstly, this is a prospective debate. That means it is about what will happen in the future. The impact of places like Iraq and Afghanistan weighs on this debate. Secondly, what does a military intervention look like? Because yes, sometimes it looks like full military intervention, but more often it looks like targeted special ops and strike teams, or things like drone strikes where you don't actually get people on the ground, but you can quickly and targetedly take out your enemy. So firstly, and setup sort of continues into this, entering the wars. What we're going to say, firstly, is that there is a higher barrier to entry into these conflicts on the negative side of the house. Let's be clear, this debate presumes a binary choice. On our side of the house, we argue that Western governments will only get involved when it's absolutely necessary, when the conflict is particularly extreme. That is because there are higher costs to getting involved when you're having to risk your military. What are those costs? Firstly, most importantly, there is a much larger degree of political scrutiny. In the wake of Iraq, in the wake of Afghanistan, people are far more aware of of how bad military intervention can be at its worst. But more importantly, people are just aware of what the military does. Often funds are done very covertly. Like funding is often secret through the CIA. It's unclear if people have any awareness of all. They can't really keep their governments accountable. There's not really a political incentive not to enter on the affirmative side of the house. There's no like sending the troops to die narrative to compete against. But secondly, it just requires a lot more capital, right? Funds, although you're giving them money, you're probably giving them less money than you're putting on the line with sending in the US military. It's cheaper and quicker. So which wars do we enter into on side negative? We would suppose that you enter into the most necessary wars. That's wars like when NATO entered Yugoslavia to literally stop a genocide. Those are instances where it's probably, that these actors would self-select into doing it. But notably, these are the situations where funds just wouldn't be enough on their side of the house. And that's the first key harm, right? Just because of virtue of not having enough numbers or not having enough ability to just fight the enemy without a big Western army, there are going to be some situations, and maybe they're the minority, where you're condemning groups of ethnic minorities to die because those funds simply will not be enough. Those are the situations where we can intervene. But secondly, we say when we do go in, we would be the ones who tended to support better rebel groups. Compare that with what they try to tell you, because affirmative team tells you we're going to support the good groups, and they give some reasons. You have a long history, potentially. Maybe there's a domestic presence that supports those groups. Maybe there's oppressed minorities that are worth fighting for. These are things that could be true some of the time, but they don't explain why they're true all of the time, or even like a likelihood at the time. Compare that to very real incentives that Western nations often do have, like destabilizing countries that might be, economically tied to your enemies. Maybe that is to counter rivals. For instance, like we have seen in the Cold War, it's unclear why things like the US-China relationship are going to thaw to a level where it wouldn't be in the best interest of the US to provide funds to an actor, a rebel group that, is against China, is against Iran, just for the fact that they would put more resource strain on their enemies. That is to say, even in the instances where we both go in, I don't think the affirmative team can fiat in or just prove by likelihood in that it will only be good ones. So secondly, independently of that question, because I don't want this to be a messy debate like round 8, let's talk about what happens in the process of wars. We say there are a number of reasons why funding rebel groups, providing them assistance that is non-direct, is a bad thing. 6 of them. Firstly, they are much, much less accountable. That is, you can't scrutinize their military decisions because you don't have a direct chain of command that goes back to the US government. You can't court-martial people who commit war crimes. You don't have as much documentation about the sorts of operations that are going on. That means it is much, much harder to stop a group, A, from getting out of control and starting to commit war crimes against their ethnic enemies, but B, just generally to control strategic operations in a way that is most efficient. Secondly, it damages communities more. That is because if you have to fight using the people on the ground, you're more likely to have to conscript from local populations in order to get the manpower to actually overcome your enemy. It also means you're likely to have rebel groups do things like create create protection rackets, which are notoriously harmful when the US has funded them. Thirdly, you are much more likely to have your technology and your information end up in the wrong hands. That is because you obviously don't have a US military presence, directly fighting there. Because of things like shifting front lines and sort of insurgency conflicts that we're often talking about, that means things like weapons often just do get lost to the enemy if you don't have a direct, line of command to give it to your own soldiers. Or, information being lost to the enemy is also bad. Fourthly, these groups will have less technology, and that means that's a more brutal war. Affirmative team says that big guns are bad. We actually think that more accurate guns are good. They have less collateral damage. You're less likely to kill civilians if you have higher power technology. A drone strike kills far less people than a land combat. That is something that we absolutely do support. Fifthly, we say Western information is often particularly bad if they don't have a military presence. That is like, their spy information. That is because, they have in the past done things like misidentified rebel groups, don't know what different groups' incentives and causes are. Importantly, even if this affirmative team could be adding good ones, the West doesn't even know who the good ones are. That's probably going to be a harm. Sixthly, you are likely to fund a group that might be good at the start of it, but ends up bad, right? That's what happens with bin Laden's group in Afghanistan, right? There's a bunch of reasons why Western governments actually just don't have control there. And once it's out of your hands, that's particularly bad because now you don't have any way of getting those weapons back. Why are direct interventions better? In addition to the flips of all those mechanisms we just heard, there's a few additional reasons. Firstly, they're much more targeted. Special ops have less human risk. You don't have your own soldiers, as many of your own soldiers going in with their lives on the line. Secondly, those soldiers are better trained. That means they're less likely to commit collateral damage, or they're less likely to panic and shoot civilians in the heat of battle. Thirdly, they don't have personal incentives. Affirmative team says that they really care about their area, but maybe they have vengeance. Maybe they want to get revenge for what has been done to their families. Maybe you want to exploit people for power. There's no way of controlling that on side affirmative. Finally, there is a bigger disincentive for dictators to be brutal on negative side of the house. Because of course, dictators don't want to fight the whole United States military, but they're much more willing to fight a rebel group. I would note that to some extent, we can still collaborate with rebel groups, right? We're just like on our side of the house, we have soldiers there working as well. What are the harms of this? Firstly, the war goes for longer on their side of the house. That means you have more death, longer sanctions, more food insecurity. But it also means that you're going to have more likely to be directly complicit in funding the people that end up being the terrorists of the future. Finally, let's talk about outcomes of wars. Some quick framing here is this is the quickest way to get them support, right? Is to end the war. What are the things that we provide uniquely on side negative? Firstly, on affirmative, you can't get the guns out once the guns are in. That's once you've supplied the arms, those arms are there. They're going to, stoke conflict for decades to come. Secondly, the governments that you set up are more likely actually to be unstable. That is because the affirmative team must empower the opposition group, whereas we have much more control over every single step of the process. And maybe they don't trust the West, but maybe they also don't trust this ethnic group that's suddenly taken power. They say the West has bad incentives here, but that's in tension with their argument that the West would never support bad rebel groups. They directly have soldiers on the line on our side of the house. They don't want to set up a bad government. Third thing is on negative side, the West is more responsible for cleaning up their messes, removing things like landmines. That's particularly important for resolving a conflict in the long term. But more importantly, they just don't prolong a war that doesn't need to be fought because they don't have, they have incentives to get their troops out of there if it is a bad war that's not worth it. For all of these reasons, it's just something that it's far less efficient on side affirmative. You can't control what's going on. It's less accountable. The wars are bloodier.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the second speaker from the affirming team.
Am I audible? Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Simplest way the affirmative team will win this debate is by proving that we are the side that gets less civilian casualties. Starting here because it's for 2 reasons. Firstly, because it's the best way to end conflict, because strategies that kill enormous amounts of civilians foments the incentive of people to take up arms for themselves and is weaponized by terrorist groups in their propaganda to increase recruitment. But secondly, because it's the best way to guarantee post-conflict stability, so voters do not hold onto grudges due to decades of bloodshed, which would then cause them to prioritize violent vengeance over buying into a stable collective state. And crucially, that is the only metric that is justified by any team in this debate to explain what effectiveness means in this debate, which means that the other team cannot say we get more arms or other things like that as a kind of proxy argument to explain effectiveness, because we have explained that this is the only metric that matters in this debate. What are the negative teams' arguments suggest that there'll be more bloodshed? The first is they suggest that rebel groups are less accountable. This argument is uncomparative in three respects. Firstly, because Western militaries have a greater incentive and capacity to cover up war crimes than they do exist, which is to say that they do not want to erode the domestic political will that is responsible for them being there in the first place, which means they do things like cover up because they don't want it to be reported by the American media. They do things like kill all eyewitnesses at that scene. And comparatively, local rebel groups have far less capacity to do so because they have less weapons and they don't have that advantage, but also because they have less incentive to do that because they are often allied with local populations. They require the support of local populations in order to be effective, and they often require the buy-in of these people in the long term because many of these people have political ideals, which mean that they want to have a stable regime in the long run, which means they cannot afford to do things like war crimes. But secondly, we would say that it's actually, in fact, easier to hold rebel groups to criminal accountability, which is to say that in the event that a war crime occurs, you can clearly do things like in the aftermath of the war, do things like hold these rebels to account in domestic courts where citizens have standing, where there's often greater evidence. Whereas by contrast, the set of Western soldiers that do commit crimes are held to account in military courts where the processes are far less opaque and far less transparent. So, but thirdly, it does not matter if rebel groups have less accountability if they have a lesser incentive to commit war crimes in the first place. And all of Kat's analysis suggests that these are people that do care about the buy-in of getting buy-in from these citizens, require working with these local populations to be effective in the first place, which means it's a lesser incentive for them to commit war crimes in the first place. And you have to compare that to the incentives of the Western military, who and all the things there, because even if you believe that Western soldiers are better trained, that does not take anything away from the fact that they are often incredibly racist and xenophobic, but also training does nothing in contexts where you are extremely stressed, where you are placed in situations where you fear that your life is about to be taken. And in those reduced states of irrationality, people are far more likely to resort to cognitive biases and are far more likely to make decisions based on racist calculations rather than based on rational calculuses. And their final claim to suggest that people are less, that Western soldiers are far better, is to suggest that they do not want to risk troops in the first place. But that was in fact the harm, because the way in which you ensured as the US military that your troops did not die is to ensure that every time you deployed your troops, you accompanied that with enormous carpet bombing to wipe out any other kind of insurgency that might threaten the lives of your troops. That was precisely the harm that we pointed to in this debate and explained that local populations simply did not have that capacity. The last thing I want to note is it's insufficient for this negative team to say, well, the problem is maybe we have more weapons and that's a bad thing, but at least we have more precise weapons. Those are the exact weapons that we would give to these rebel groups. So that thing was symmetric in this debate. They clearly couldn't win on that issue. The simple way in which I'm going to explain that militaries are far more likely to rely upon strategies that incur enormous amounts of bloodshed is by comparing the comparative advantages of local rebel groups with that of the Western military. Because as this negative team do concede, the only strategic advantage that Western militaries do have in these contexts is to rely upon overwhelming firepower. The reason why that is bad is that it's clearly indiscriminate. And the reasons why they're likely to use this are twofold. Firstly, because they're often captured by military industrial complexes, which call and require them to use the most expansive and maximalist strategies possible, which are enormously harmful. And to the extent that they've already spent billions of dollars on these kinds of things, often these governments resort to path dependency and therefore are likely to use these strategies. By contrast, local military groups, rebel groups, do not have that capacity. What they do rely upon instead is to, interact with local populations, intelligence on the ground, far more calculated and guerrilla tactics, which are not accompanied by those maximalist warfare. But secondly, as I already alluded to in my previous response, the fact is the reason why the Western military over relies upon its kind of strategic advantage of enormous firepower is because they use that in order to insulate the safety of their troops. And the reason why they care about that is because they care about preserving the domestic political buy-in, because the death of one soldier is likely to cause them to pull out of the war. Simply, if you believe that there are more guns in the side negative, we've explained why that results in more civilian casualties. That is a clear reason why we're ahead in this debate. Next question I'm going to engage in is on the question of the proclivity of interventions. They say that they raise the barrier of entry in their world. There are a number of responses. The first thing to say is do not think that this is an argument that is in debate, for the very simple reason that this debate is about the perspective of the Western nation about to engage in a war and whether or not they do so indirectly or directly. So presumably the proclivity to engage is already symmetric in this respect. But even if you believe that it's in the debate, we offer a series of responses. Firstly, we would say that on both sides, Western forces choose to go on wars on a series of incentive structures that relatively stay symmetric, which is to say that if it is a war that is done in the Western nation's self-interest, like for instance, the United States of America in Iraq, that is likely to happen in both contexts. But if anything, our side is the side that increases the likelihood that you would go into war, not based purely on self-interest, but based on the interest of more altruistic things, which is to say, to interact and to help forces, ethnic rebel groups that were on ethnic sectarian lines. That's for the very simple reason that to the extent that you have less to lose by indirectly funding a rebel group, you're more likely to do things out of not out of self-interest, because you have another additional way of engaging in the war that does not rely on enormous costs. So to the extent that our side has greater numbers of interventions, those are the interventions for positive causes, whereas the incentive to engage in negative interventions, which are bad, are relatively symmetric and therefore will not be weighed so too much in this debate. The last question I'm going to engage with is on the question of post-conflict stability. None of the negative team's arguments have anything to suggest that the kinds of context we are talking about result in greater states into the long run. And that is probably the most devastating reason why the negative team win, because even if wars are more protracted on our side, it's unclear why there is a harm if it is the case that you believe that those protracted wars incur less civilian bloodshed, but also if you believe that those longer wars at least result in an end outcome that is entirely stable. And we give you a series of arguments to suggest that it is far more stable in our world. And the crucial one that is perhaps only exclusively unique to the affirmative team bench is at the very least, the end outcome of the state in our world is not tied in with the perception of being allied with a Western nation, is not directly, in the kind of bind of a Western nation, which means they often have to do policies that directly benefit the United States for quid pro quo. And also because, and at the very least, even if that is symmetric, at the very least, people do not believe that state is directly associated with the West, directly associated with imperialist force, which increases the incentive to do things like rebel against that state. The last thing I want to deal with is their argument about why we will just fund terrorists. Firstly, we explained that this is a marginal case insofar as you believe Kat's argumentation suggests that there are strong incentives and capacities on these states to pre-select to ensure that you do not find terrorists in the first place. But secondly, it's unclear why we couldn't, for instance, use this loan conditionally, which is to say that if they do use it against the interest of the Western nation, that is the reason for why we would pool funding, which means that we are actually able to exert an enormous degree of accountability on that in these respects. Because we decide that reduces the amount of civil bloodshed, and because that's the best pathway to peace, we decide that winning this.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the second speaker of the negating team.
Give me a second just to set up my paper and stuff. Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Wait, hold on. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. If what you care about is minimizing collateral damage and ensuring that the people of the country are safe, the exact opposite of what you want to do is give a bunch of money to a bunch of random rebel groups who are totally unaccountable, who are totally lacking in training, you have no capacity to control what they do. What that does is create continued humanitarian crises, which you have no capacity to end once you have started them. Clearly a side negative win. 3 issues in this speech. Firstly, on defending rebel groups. Secondly, on collateral damage. And thirdly, on getting better governments after wars. First issue I'm going to address here is defending these rebel groups and whether they're worth defending. And I address that first because it characterizes a lot of what these rebel groups look like. And if we win this clash, we prove pretty conclusively the people you are giving money to are extremely damaging, are extremely harmful, have a bunch of perverse incentives to do things poorly and damage the countries for which they are fighting against the governments of. So firstly, on characterization then, they give us 3 pushes at Cat speech. Firstly, they say that these rebel groups have long histories, therefore we know whether they're good or bad and what they're likely to do with the funding. Firstly, this is entirely assertive, clearly not universally true. Many rebel groups are new and those ones could get funding as well. But secondly, it seems unlikely that the rebel groups with long histories are the ones that get funded. For the reason that if a rebel group has existed for a long period of time, it's probably likely at some point in that history, they engaged in some level of abuse of people, engaged in some kinds of human rights abuses, have some kind of questions raised about them. Therefore, the more likely groups that get funded are the ones that are new, the ones that have no track record, have no capacity to be slandered, have no risk attached to them because you can't be considered as funding group who's historically done bad things, which means that what we're probably funding here is new rebel groups without any track record, which therefore have a clean slate able to be funded without political opposition. Second push we hear from Cat is that there is domestic political pressure to ensure that only the best rebel groups get funded. First issue with this is we explained to you at will that a lot of the time funding is done covertly through the CIA, which means that often domestic citizens just have no knowledge of which rebel groups are being funded. Secondly, though, people care a lot less about instances of funding rebel groups than they do about sending their own troops. The reason that they care a lot more about their own citizens than they do about group people in other countries, which means they pay much more attention to the news when the news is talking about funding like actual troops as opposed to funding rebel groups. Often many people just won't know that the US, even if they were doing it publicly, was in fact funding a rebel group and wouldn't scrutinize that super heavily. But thirdly, even if there was capacity for strong domestic political pressure against funding an evil rebel group, it's quite easy for governments to skew what these rebel groups look like for the reason that there's limited access to information about what these rebel groups do, what they look like, and therefore the image of these rebel groups can easily be skewed by Western governments as opposed to direct military intervention where there is far more scrutiny. Third claim we hear from Cat is that they have security concerns who would never fund an evil rebel group. 2 issues with that is, firstly, they might be concerned about their own security, but they're unconcerned about the security of the country that they invade, because if they do like mess up that country and cause a bunch of instability, they can just cut that funding and pull out and experience no consequences. But secondly, it's just very unlikely that they're ever meaningfully concerned about the security of their own country, because if they fund a rebel group, it's just unlikely that that rebel group is again going to somehow, for example, invade the US. So it's unclear that they do care particularly about these kinds of security concerns. What does it mean then for this debate? It means that firstly, all of the substantive material about protecting ethnic minorities, about protecting people who are being attacked, it's just untrue, because most of these rebel groups don't look like those kind of vulnerable individuals. They look like often bad actors that are in fact harming countries and rebels for nefarious reasons. It also means that we should buy all of our substantive material about the way that these people engage in brutal, messy warfare far, far heavily. Second clash in this debate then on collateral damage. Firstly, on how rebels engage in large amounts of collateral damage. First push we hear from them is that they have greater incentive than Western actors to care about protecting the country's infrastructure. Firstly, this is symmetric to the extent that the West already also has incentive to care about infrastructure, firstly, because they're accountable to their own people, which means that if they do things like bomb factories or bomb train stations, they get scrutinized for that, which means that they have incentive not to destroy these countries' infrastructure. But secondly, the West cares about the long-term stability of these countries as well, because if they're invading a country, they have reasons to do that. They must therefore want the long-term security of these countries to be significant, and they wouldn't do things like deliberately bomb infrastructures. But secondly, this is contingent, what they prove here is that rebel groups have incentive to care about infrastructure, but they don't prove that rebel groups have capacity to actually engage in that kind of warfare. We explained the types of warfare they must necessarily engage in are far more destructive and far more brutal, but also that often rebel groups just don't have long-termist planning, which means that they do things that are maybe not in their long-term interests, because it advances their short-term interests and gets them ahead in a war which they are currently losing. Second claim we hear from them then is that they care more about the people because they're a part of that country, whereas Western actors don't give a shit about the people who they're invading. Firstly, this is in tension with their characterization that these people are largely ethnic minorities that have been forced under oppression, because that would suggest to you that the people who they are attacking are not part of the same ethnic group that they are, and therefore that they have very little incentive to care about them for any reasons of national pride. But secondly, we explained to you that they often have incentive to seek vengeance against people because they have been in areas occupied by their enemy, which they have just taken over, which means that they want to attack those people because they see them as having supported the regime who they're attacking. Third issue with this, though, is even if they do have incentive, once again, they fail to prove that they have the capacity to protect people. Firstly, we explained to you that they must engage in more brutal methods of warfare because they just can only use guns. They can't do things like targeted drone strikes, specifically at leaders of the enemy. They have to engage in on-the-ground guerrilla warfare, which often leads to lots of mistakes. But secondly, we explain they have no accountability on troops, which means even if the leadership of these rebel groups cares about individuals, the individual soldiers might not, or the individual soldiers might make mistakes, and we have no capacity to know or understand what they're doing. Comparatively, the US military obviously has more accountability between, for example, individual troops and higher ups compared to these rebel groups. Third claim they make then is that there are just less bombings because they don't do things like drones. Firstly, we explained to you that drones are actually a good thing. They are targeted, they are specific, and they are efficient, which means that you don't attack civilians, you attack specifically things like the leaders of other countries. But secondly, we explain, like, actually, it's just untrue that they would just stop bombing if you have rebel groups. Rebel groups engage in things like bombing all the time. But instead of using drones, which are more targeted, have better access to intel, they do things like, firstly, use conventional artillery, which is more likely to miss, which means you hit more civilians. Secondly, they do things like plant bombs in civilian areas and set up mines, etc., which are obviously far less targeted than a drone strike. So you still get things like mass scale bombing. It's just done far less efficiently. Fourth claim they make then is that rebel groups have better knowledge of the terrain, so they fight more efficiently. Firstly, this is symmetric. Obviously, we would engage in strategy. We would talk to people from that local area about how to engage in warfare. We would plan this out. But secondly, it's unclear that knowing the terrain makes you any better at, for example, distinguishing between who is an enemy and who is a civilian, or knowledge of the terrain makes you better at aiming an artillery gun, or knowledge of the terrain makes a bomb that you set off in a train station any less focused. All that should suggest that rebel groups are extremely messy. There are large amounts of collateral damage from what they engage in. Next, let's talk about whether the West has large amounts of collateral damage. First push we get from Brendon is that the West might be better trained, but in times of stressful situations, that training disappears and they get extremely messy. Firstly, to the extent that Western troops are experiencing lots of stress and therefore make mistakes, obviously rebel groups experience the same level of stress and therefore make mistakes as well. But secondly, when we explain to you that they were better trained, that doesn't just mean in the context of firing down an artillery range, that also includes things like being trained to deal with stress, being trained to deal with the mental pressure of war, and stay accountable and still engage in better actions, which is why that training is still useful, even if situations are extremely stressful. Second push we hear from Brendon is that what they would do is carpet bomb areas in order to protect their own troops. Firstly, we explain that they have incentives not to do things like large-scale carpet bombing because that would inspire local opposition, which would make future warfare harder. But secondly, this is empirically untrue. The US hasn't engaged in carpet bombing of entire areas since like the Vietnam War. Modern warfare looks far more like targeted drone strikes specifically at leaders or commanders of opposing groups rather than bombing entire civilian areas with planes. That is clearly far less harmful than carpet bombing. Third push we hear from Brendon is that the US is captured by the military-industrial complex, which means they must use maximalist warfare. First issue with this is often the most expensive tech is actually less destructive because what makes that tech expensive is things like the like drone strikes having good like cameras and stuff to distinguish between who's a target and who's not, or things like being specifically targeted at certain areas rather than just blanket carpet bombing. But secondly, the military-industrial complex doesn't care as much about how often their weapons are used. They just care about getting sales. Finally, in the last 30 seconds of the speech on better governments, they tell you that the US has self-interested and therefore will set up bad governments. Firstly, intention again with their initial characterization of what Western governments look like, but also they have domestic pressure against them to set up bad governments in a way. They say they get black backslide, obviously symmetric to rebels because rebels rarely are ever stable. And secondly, Western legitimacy is often helpful because you see that it ensures the winning side doesn't get immediately overthrown because people know that they aren't going to be able to win if they engage in a second rebel invasion. For those reasons, very, very proud to get a clear negative win.
Thank you very much. I would like to welcome the third speaker of the affirming team.
Hey, can I be heard? Cool, I might just take a minute to set up my paper if that's all right. All right, sorry about that. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Actually, no, I wasn't starting in 3, 2, 1. I don't know why I just said that. I said that reflexively. All right, now I'm actually starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The clearest reason the affirmative team wins this debate is because we explain that rebel groups are often groups who are just getting fucked over by the state. There are groups of people who are getting ethnically cleansed, who are getting attacked, and who have asymmetric power. And the only thing we know for certain is that when we give these people weapons and help, we're going to help them. We explain 3 reasons why they're likely to be particularly vulnerable and getting attacked. The fact they're often an ethnic minority, the fact that they often the reason they are rebels is because they're getting mistreated. And the fact that regardless of the reason that they're rebels, governments clearly have incentives to just go and absolutely just destroy rebels as much as possible. That means that they are often getting destroyed, and we help them in 3 ways. First, we give them weaponry to defend themselves. Second, we provide disincentives to attack them in the first instance. And third, we provide them with things like logistical support, because when you're helping someone militarily, you often do things like give them food and medicine. That's obviously helpful for them to fight, but it is also just means that people have food and people have medicine in these areas. We also explain to you that so their response here is just to say, we could help them in other ways. For instance, we could just give them food anyway. But we explain that there's little political incentive to be able to help them at the point where they're not part of your military strategy. There's no political capital to help some random rebel group. And military budgets are just structurally much, much bigger than things like foreign aid budgets. So we're not going to be able to provide this sort of help to them unless it is part of our military strategy. Their next response is, we'd help them anyway, just by winning the war. First, this is enormously contingent on you believing that they are so much more effective at winning the war than we are, such that they are going to be able to help them far better. Because even if they're slightly better at winning the war, we still come out ahead on the defense of these groups. If we literally just help them during the war, we provide them with things like food aid. But I also give you 3 reasons why it is that just attacking their enemy isn't actually likely to make their lives that much better in the short term. First, much of the help, just like providing food and medicine and stuff, isn't part of the kind of military upshot that they could get. Second, often your military strategy just doesn't coincide with choosing to defend these groups. They rely on the cases where you might happen to have these be the same things. We explain that now always you would be helping them out. And third, the opportunity cost, if the argument here is we're going to stop them from being attacked because we're going to engage the sets of people who are attacking them, there often isn't a high opportunity cost to the bad regimes that we're attacking, because it's quite easy for them to fuck over a rebel group, right? You just send a few planes with some chemical weapons because they can't defend themselves. So it doesn't particularly help them. At the end of that, there was an enormously vulnerable group of people who we were helping to defend themselves, who we were helping to make sure that their lives weren't awful. That is the clearest path to the affirmative team winning this debate. Next, let's delete their argument about there being a higher barrier to entry in war. First, it's not clear that a higher barrier to entry is necessarily good. Often we need to intervene. Second, it's not at all clear to me that this is within the debate. This is an as opposed to debate, which kind of assumes that this is where we're trading off between 2 options. Third, I would say there often is a political incentive to go to more war when it is public and you have boots on the ground, because there are enormous political payoffs to going to war. George W. Bush was able to go to war in the Middle East because it gave him a huge political upshot. You get to act like a strongman. Fourth, I'd say you're more likely to go to war because the military industrial complex now has a larger stake in that war when you are more directly buying things like their Predator drones, which means that they're more likely to lobby. Their claim here is that you only go into the best sets of wars for the reason that those are the ones that have the most incentive. But this is actually not true. When you're going into a war for humanitarian reasons, there often isn't much. There's maybe a few sets of domestic political pressures from activists, but we would say the worst kinds of wars are actually the wars where you have the most incentive, because it's the ones where you're going in, for instance, for oil or economic reasons, where you have enormous amounts of lobbying and enormous amounts of economic incentive. It's not clear to me that that was within the debate, but they keep on trying to win on it, so I thought I'd delete it anyway. Now let's look at how much collateral damage is actually done. They make 4 claims. First, they say these troops are less accountable. First, it's often hard to hold them accountable. You can't see what they're doing, like what a Western soldier is doing at every point. Secondly, accountability to the West isn't actually a benefit unless you believe that the West is a better actor. And we point out that the West actually doesn't particularly have an incentive to care about what happens in these countries. Proving accountability to the West relies on them proving that the West is a better actor who's more likely to care about these countries. Third, often you don't want to hold these soldiers accountable because it's unpopular for your military. You don't want to disclose to the public what these soldiers have done by court-martialing them. Their next claim is they're likely to conscript people. First, rebel groups often don't need to constrict people. These people are so fucked over that they've come to this rebel group so they have enough of a supply of soldiers anyway. Second, rebel groups often can't conscript people because they don't control the state. They don't have all of the sort of industry that they need to do conscription or of the infrastructure. And third, the West often does things that are like conscription in name only, like using propaganda and economic disadvantage to get minority kids to come into the military when they can't really consent. Their third claim is that your technology now goes to bad actors. First, you can get that technology coming in when you kill a Western soldier and take it off them anyway. And secondly, because we wouldn't be giving them our worst, most destructive technology, like the Predator drones, it means the harm of that going over to the enemy is in fact lower, which is why we flipped that. Their final claim is that this weaponry is better targeted, so there is less collateral damage. I'd point out we can still give them the targeted stuff. Often we're just not giving them the most big stuff. But second, even if they're better targeted, if they're bigger bombs, they kill more people. I just want to point to the amount of shit that Western forces do, right? Which is awful. And all of the stories that we've heard about war crimes, the idea that Western troops are likely to be better is absurd because they talk about a little targeted Predator drone. You shouldn't imagine when they say that like a little bullet that's perfectly finding its way to kill the one guy that we're trying to find. A targeted Predator drone is perfectly targeting a building that we're attempting to blow up. These things are not particularly well targeted. Why do we tell you that they're likely to have less collateral damage? We explain, first of all, that they have more of an incentive to continue living because they will continue living there. They want to continue running that country after the war. They have more of an incentive to care. The response from the negative team is, these nations might care anyway. This is first, like the West might care anyway. This is first in tension with their claim that the West doesn't care and therefore will fund terrorist groups. But secondly, you obviously care more at the point where you are the people who are going to continue living there. The next thing we explain is that they are deeply nationalistic, like they're often deeply nationalistic and therefore have more of an incentive to care about their fellow people. They say, they might be ethnic minorities who therefore just want to fuck over people. But other ethnic minorities probably live in those cities and in that country. You're not going to want to kill them. Third, we explain quite simply, and this is the biggest thing that sinks this negative team on collateral damage, is that we're not going to give them our biggest, most destructive technology. And that means that less collateral damage can't happen. And fourth, we explain because they understand the terrain better, they're less likely to need to use as blunt tools. So they're not going to need to do as bigger bombings, They then keep on saying, they don't have the capacity to not do worse things, right? But the capacity to not commit war crimes, obviously you have the capacity to not commit sets of war crimes. It is not doing a thing. Let's then look at the long term, which is their other way to attempt to win this debate. So we explain 2 reasons why the long-term government will be better after the West wins. First, we explain that you're less likely to backslide into your old regime. And that means that you are less likely to get the bad regime that they took over in the first place, because often these countries are seen as these new regimes are seen as deeply Western when they're set up by the West. So they don't even get the victory that they want. And the second thing that we explain is that now the West won't be setting up the government. So it's less likely to be a government that the West sets up, for instance, to do things like privatize oil rights and sell them off to the West. So the new government will be more in tune with what the people actually want, because we're funding a rebel group which is made up of the people who are in that country and then care. They say this is in tension with the thing about domestic political pressure. Obviously, it's possible to have domestic political pressure from the West not to fund future terrorist groups, and at the same time to have the West having domestic political pressure to privatize assets and help their own economy. Their claim here is you're going to fund terrorism into the long term. I think first, often funding isn't the thing that stops terrorism. It's not the degree of funding that is a problem, right? It's about creating discontent. Things like doing a lone wolf attack don't require a lot of money. They're about creating discontent. We explain that we get less discontent, where you would explain we get more discontent when military intervention from the West kills people. We also point out a stack of reasons, both our fair and structural reasons, why it is they're likely to select groups well, and that means that we're unlikely to get really bad groups that are funded.
Thank you very much. To conclude the substantive portion of the debate, I'd like to welcome the third speaker from the negating team.
Noting that the entire affirmative case is contingent on these rebels being good actors who it is a good idea to fund, that's the first question I'm going to look at in this speech. Who are these rebels? They give us a number of reasons to suggest they'll be good. Firstly, that they have a long history, but this is an assertion. Look at the Syrian civil war and the Free Syrian forces. Western nations do not have perfect information. Often these rebel groups are formed in the aftermath of a conflict breaking out. So that's just an assertion that can be disregarded. Secondly, they tell us that there's public political pressure in the West for these governments to choose good rebel groups because they don't want to be known as the government that chose the chose wrong. But we note, importantly, this debate requires a degree of covertness because you are sharing classified intelligence with a foreign rebel group. You don't want those rebel groups to be known as Western puppets for reasons Affirmative themselves outline, which means it's incredibly likely this is done very quietly through things like intelligence agencies, through things like congressional committees, rather than openly in the very way it has been done in Afghanistan with CIA, for example. The third and most compelling push is that these rebel groups are often minorities who are oppressed, and it is actively a good idea to fund them. And this is their most compelling, but we would note importantly that comparatively speaking, we have a far more effective form of protecting them inside negative when you can simply drone strike the people that are attacking them, rather than handing them a rifle and sending them into the meat grinder against a formal army that is probably much better trained, that probably has a lot more resources. You can use military interventions as a deterrent, telling that foreign government to stop oppressing your minority population, and substantially deter them without putting a rifle in the hands of people and putting them in harm's way and making themselves responsible for their own defense. Clearly, if you believe in deterring crimes against minorities, it is the negative team which offers the far stronger deterrent and the far more effective one. The final thing they do, noting all of these structural flaws in their case, is falling back to fear. Well, they would just fear we would simply choose good rebel groups. But we explain 3 reasons this also fails. Firstly, structurally, Western intelligence agencies have enormous intelligence gaps, and there's likely to be very bad problems in selecting. That's because of things like language barriers. That's because of the fact that they might not have very up-to-date relevant intelligence within that country. Noting, historically, for example, the US abducted a bunch of people during the war on terror to Guantanamo who just had the same names as suspected terrorists rather than the actual guys. They get this wrong all the time. They are very likely to get this wrong in terms of picking good rebel groups. Secondly, we tell you that even if groups are good to begin with, they change over time. Power can corrupt them. They can get different leaders who might be more extreme and more radical in response to changing circumstances. But thirdly, even if you believe these rebel groups are chosen well and they're always good, all of our harms about having more frequent and more prolonged conflicts still apply, even when those rebel groups have good incentives and want to do the right thing. Brendon finally throws in a Hail Mary at second that, well, we can just make the funds conditional. So if they become bad, we can cut them off. But it's too late. You've already shipped arms into that country. The horse has bolted. It is already out available for people who have now turned bad to use it to terrorize the rest of the population. So in terms of weighing for this debate, for every good Kurdish group you fund who can now defend themselves against a tyrannical government, you also have to accept that you might be funding the next Taliban. And you should contrast that to the certainty we offer you on side negative. You're not guaranteed to destabilize the country by putting weapons into the hands of people who are very likely to structurally misuse them. That is the first reason we win this debate. The vast majority of their benefits being contingent on that characterization now largely fall, or at least are made significantly uncertain. The second question I want to ask in this speech then is on the number of wars. And I wonder if they try and muddy the waters here a bit, but we would note, obviously the debate does not say that we have to support, a full invasion and regime change in Syria every time America would otherwise have launched a predator drone or funded a rebel group. We note structurally right from first that there is just a higher political and economic cost of using your own military rather than just throwing money and militarily industrial complex weapons at the problem. Matt tries to equivocate on this by saying that, well, the military industrial complex would want you to intervene in our world, but note that they would also want to sell weapons to rebel groups in the first place. So that's symmetric. We would explain there is a relative difference in the number of conflicts that can get started, the number of conflicts that the West is willing to join, and that it is more likely in the affirmative team's world. So if you believe that war is bad and these rebels aren't unquestionably good actors, the affirmative team lose the debate at this point because more wars are always worse than no wars in almost all circumstances. Fine. All right. Third question I want to talk about is on the quality of war. And this is where the majority of the affirmative team case lies. But I want to note that almost all of their claims about collateral damage are either contingent on their characterization or just outright assertions. The first thing they tell us is that rebel groups are comparatively better than the West because they have an incentive to care about the country. First problem with this is that they never specify what caring about the country looks like. They might envision a country that doesn't have any of their ethnic minorities in it. They might envision a country where all of their political enemies have been murdered. There is no specification as to why these incentives or these visions that these rebel groups have are good. But secondly, we would note even if they have incentives to care about the country, they've got a countervailing, stronger incentive to win at all costs because it's a necessary precondition to be able to reshape that country, to be able to take power in the end, which means you're still likely to see widespread collateral damage. The second push they give us is that the West would just carpet bomb you because it's captured by the military-industrial complex. First problem with this, we tell you that the military-industrial complex sells precision tools that often have very high margins on them, things like predator drones with advanced computing in them. So you don't carpet bomb in order for the military-industrial complex to make a profit. profit. You just sell advanced technology that is more precise, that has less collateral damage. But secondly, for reasons affirmative team themselves outline, if you want to intervene and stop a conflict and stop things escalating further, then indiscriminate carpet bombing is the worst way to win hearts and minds. It's the worst way to break the cycle of hatred and of insurgencies and terrorist recruiting. So obviously there are incredibly strong incentives to not do that. You do not win hearts and minds by going beast mode on a bunch of unarmed civilians. They say that they won't have advanced weaponry, but we tell you that's actually a bad thing, I think, because it requires more conventional warfare and conscription. They say, well, no, you don't need to rely on conscription. But obviously you do, because if you're just giving them more primitive versions of technology like rifles and expecting them to fight a conventional war without things like massive aerial support, obviously that necessitates more moving front lines, necessitates more conventional warfare that requires more people to get caught up in the middle of it. The final thing they tell us, the third thing they tell us is that, well, rebels understand the terrain more. Obviously, you can hire locals, you can use satellite imagery. It's unclear why terrain is such a massive disadvantage in this circumstance. The final thing they tell us is that foreign war crimes are bad. And Matt tells us, think of all the Western war crimes you've heard about. Exactly. We've heard about them. Because foreign militaries have formal whistleblowing channels. They have embedded journalists when there is a declared war. They have freedom of information laws, which means that even when they do happen, there is at least some scrutiny compared to a rebel group where no one knows there is even a war going on with Western backing. There is no scrutiny and no accountability. The second push they have, though, is like, well, you can hold rebels accountable when they do bad things. But the affirmative case presupposes that the rebels win. Why the hell would they put their own people on trial for bad things that they have done if they have now taken over the country and disposed of their enemies? We tell you very simply on the issue of collateral damage. These people are trained far less, so there is more likely to be collateral damage. They have to rely on lower tech warfare, which necessitates more conscription and cannon fodder. That an insurgency requires brutal tactics like bombing, and that you have far worse oversight and accountability. Your civilian casualties shoot up exponentially just during the course of the war alone. The affirmative team cannot win the debate at this point. But final thing I want to talk about in this speech is the aftermath. Because not only does this affirmative team increase civilian casualties during the war, they also create a massive power vacuum and problems afterwards. Because they claim you have more stability, but the substantive material we bring you about why and history tell us the opposite, right? You are releasing enormous supplies of weapons into a country with ethnic division and a weak, unstable government. What do you think is going to happen? There is every incentive in the world when there is weak state capacity, when people don't accept this new regime as legitimate, to take up arms against that former government, just as what happened in Iraq. They claim that because it's not a Western government, it'll be more legitimate. But firstly, this is in tension with their own characterization. If it's a minority group that is taking power, why would the ethnic majority of that country respect them? Why would they be willing to consider them a legitimate government? Secondly, I would know we don't have to endorse regime change on side negative. We're happy to do things like drone strikes and start targeted SEAL team hits. That's not something that we necessarily have to adopt as a burden. But thirdly, to the extent that we do support regime change and more direct influence, so you set up a constitutional system that works, that isn't too far tilted in favor of one particular ethnic group, is probably a good thing in terms of long-term stability, making sure people don't feel disenfranchised by this new regime. You get more wars on side affirmative, you get worse wars. You have no idea who the hell these rebel groups are, and as a result, you are going to get Iraqs into the future, into perpetuity. Vote negative.
Thank you very much. I would like to welcome the negating leader's reply.
Sam explains why these are likely not good actors, who are these rebel groups, in which, if you believe that, it is a clear win for side negative. So to extend the margin, I'm going to assume for most of this reply that affirmative can choose to find good rebel actors. And why do we still win by a reasonably clear margin in that case? First question, when do you get involved? Because independently of whether you support good rebels or not, you get involved in more conflicts on side affirmative. This is important because affirmative's rhetoric in this debate relies on the West being a bad influence most of the time. Their responses are two. First, they say it's not always good to not intervene. But we explain right back at first why on our side you self-select into using military only in the ones where you are needed. The second is to repeat that it's not within the debate. Sam deals with this. At this point, you either believe it or not. But I think this material is particularly important because, firstly, we outline right back at first a set of instances where only direct military intervention can save ethnic minorities. That is, this funding would not be enough to stop a genocide, which means even if accountability, collateral damage, state creation clashes are all marginal, this is a clear win and a clear reason you should give it to side negative. The second reason in weighing here is that the West does have bad incentives, sometimes on both sides, like Cold War incentives. But on our side, we don't empower those bad rebels as a result of those incentives. On their side, they directly do. Secondly, let's talk about casualties and collateral damage. This is where most of the debate was, but I don't know if it's where most of the important material in the debate was. The first clash was on accountability. Our claim was simple and true. The US military isn't perfect, but at least there are whistleblowers. At least Western media and court martials exist. AF has a few less significant pushes. First, they say that the domestic courts in these systems were better, which is completely contingent on their state building being successful. Secondly, they say they'll make the funding conditional. We explain why that won't work. And finally, they say, well, domestic support for the US military only cares about US soldiers' lives, so carpet bombing will get the okay. But we explained that that is asserted. Often people care about humanitarian outcomes as well. But more importantly, the US has no incentive to do that because it wouldn't win hearts and minds. The second subclash here was on weapons. There was a clash about whether they were more targeted or bigger. There was a clash about the military-industrial complex. But Charlie explains why they want precision to no response. And I think that's the more likely characterization there. Even if it's not, it's marginal. Finally, on training, thirdly, on training, clearly that's better on our side, stress included. But even if it wasn't, conscription is a certain harm on their side that doesn't exist on ours. Fourth, incentives. The affirmative team here relies on rebels always being mistreated ethnic minorities. But if at least some of them hold ethnically motivated grudges, which we prove is likely, then you have far worse outcomes when they get the guns rather than the US military. Plus, there was no response from side affirmative to our material about the incentive of the dictator to crack down harder if they know the US military isn't going to get involved. But finally, even if you didn't buy any of that material from us, we tell you the length of the war is the most important thing, because even if the war is marginally more damaging to civilians, a quicker war, a quicker end to the conflict will kill less people. You are more certain to get that when you have the US military involved. Finally, let's talk about setting up governments and leaving the conflict. The first thing I want to note within this point is, independently of anything else within this clash, the certain thing we do have is we can leave and we can take our weapons with us. If in some instances there are bad actors, those bad actors do definitely have the weapons on their side of the house. But secondly, let's more broadly talk about nation building, because the affirmative claim rests on the characterization that everyone will hate Western influence. We firstly explain that this is relatively symmetric, because often these will be divided ethnic minority countries, and that means they will hate whoever's in power anyway. But secondly, and more importantly, we explain how we have more direct control over setting up the government. That means it's more likely that the government ends up functional than when you've just provided some funds to some miscellaneous rebel groups. The war is quicker, the war doesn't happen as often, and the war is less damaging to the people involved. Vote negative.
Thank you very much. To conclude the debate, I'd love to welcome the affirming leader's reply.
I want to start this reply with the only freestanding impact in this debate, which is our benefit of assisting rebel groups in defending themselves. And the reason why this is the most important impact in this debate is twofold. Firstly, because it's only certain benefit, but it's not contingent on what these groups are, even if they are not ethnic minorities, even if they do not share the ideological values of the West. Self-defense was an inherent good in and of itself, and it did not rely upon this even being successful. But secondly, because the only issue that the side negative does not truly contest, because they only mitigate this by saying, well, sometimes it coincides with military interventions some of the time, whereas our benefit happens all of the time. Given that non-contested impact that is in the bank, the burden of the opposition bench is to prove that on the comparative, using rebel groups would result in so much more costly war and so much less stable war. So let's start on the first question of which side minimizes civilian bloodshed. The problem with this negative team was that they were extraordinarily uncomparative, because at the neg, they say, well, some rebel groups sometimes do bad things. That is, of course, true. But the question is, who is more likely to do those things? And to check your notes, side affirmative was the only side to give you structural reasons to suggest that rebel groups were less likely to do war crimes on a series of bases. Firstly, due to differences in incentive, because We explained that local people who live in those areas do not want to deal with the repercussions of having committed a massacre in the long term, compared to an American soldier who is insulated from that benefit and is more likely to be racist and defaults that in context of stress, irrespective of training. Secondly, due to differences in firepower, the red herring given by this negative team is to say, well, we have more precise weaponry. That is not it's mutually exclusive. We would give that weaponry to the local group as well. But what was unique in this debate was that the US military often had far greater firepower and had far greater and perverse incentives to rely upon that firepower to indiscriminately slaughter people. And the intuition that you need to assess yourself in this debate is, do predator drones even work in minimizing bloodshed, or do they often involve the murder of countless random citizens, often not the ones that were even targeted for you to even credit this argument in the first instance? Lastly, due to differences in accountability. Firstly, because side negative attempts to claim the benefit of at least our forces are more accountable, this is immediately contradicted by their own speech to the extent that they are supporting alternatives like predator drones. But secondly, as we explained, any argument of accountability does not matter if you believe the prior characterization, which that local rebel groups had a less of an incentive to commit war crimes in the first instance, which means that arguments of accountability did not apply. But lastly, even if arguments of accountability did apply, we explained that it was far easier to hold local groups to account rather than the US military, which was totally unlikely to throw their own soldiers under the bus, were far more likely to keep that under wraps in internal military courts. So at the end of that, you did not believe that this side negative team made the lives of people any better. If at all, we explained that local rebel groups minimized bloodshed to an enormous degree of margin. So on the final question, who results in greater political stability? This perhaps is the easiest way to explain why the Affirmative team wins this debate again, because we are the only side to contemplate what is likely to be better for the end outcome of the state when the war finishes. This team does nothing to explain why the states that exist in their world will be stable, despite the negative saying we're happy to support the status quo. They never explain that why that eventuates into something that is at all stable. We explain that local groups who require the buy-in of local populations had a far greater incentive and capacity to remain in the long haul compared to militaries that had every incentive to pull out as soon as the domestic political will for that war disappeared. And for those reasons, side affirmative won.
Thank you very much to both teams. You are in the same geographical area, so you can cross the floor and shake hands and say nice things about each other in person. The judges will retire, but thank you for an excellent debate.